The first to die did so in prayer. On the agri-world of Viridia, a globe of swaying grasslands and meticulously cultivated harvest plains, the sky began to sing. It was not a sound that entered the ear, but one that resonated deep within the bone, a low monastic chant that seemed to hum from the very firmament. For days, the planetary clergy of the ecclesiarchy declared it a divine portent, a sign of the god-emperor's favor. The tithes were paid, the fields were lush, and the faithful knelt in the golden light of their sun, giving thanks for the celestial hymn that had blessed their pious world. They did not know they were praying to the architect of their own oblivion. The celestial body that eclipsed their sun was no dead rock or invading Xenos fleet. It was a world impossibly vast, moving with a purpose that defied all known laws of celestial mechanics. It was Sanctus Lis, a Cardinal World reborn as a monstrous vessel of pilgrimage, now named Sanctum Peregrinus, where sprawling hive cities had once scraped the clouds. There now rose cathedral spires the size of mountain ranges, their gargoyle-haunted peaks scraping the edge of the atmosphere. Continent-sized basilicas of obsidian and gold formed the vessel's primary mass, their stained glass windows, each miles wide, depicting scenes of such zealous imperial martyrdom that they bordered on the grotesque. From its trailing pole, a ring of debris, the ground-down remnants of previously consumed moons and asteroids, orbited like a halo of shattered bone. Propulsion came not from plasma drives, but from colossal engine cathedrals, their exhaust bells shaped like the mouths of a cherubic choir, venting plumes of incandescent soul fire that sang a terrible, deep bass note in the choir of the void. The planetary defense force of Viridia was loyal and brave, but they were prepared for pirates and raiding parties, not for the arrival of a vengeful god. The laser batteries that dotted the green plains fired their lances of light at the approaching world, beams that splashed harmlessly against continent-spanning void shields that shimmered with the images of Imperial saints. The small defense fleet, a handful of frigates and destroyers, charged forward, their guns blazing defiance. They were swatted from the sky by colossal grappling chains, each link the size of a battleship, launched from weapon shrines built into the world ship's crust. The chains did not just smash hulls, they latched on, reeling the ships in like caught fish, dragging them down into gaping cathedral maws where they were consumed by molten metal in unending prayer. Then, Sanctum Peregrinus began its true work. From its ventral continents, immense structures descended, things of baroque gold and dark iron that were part mining claw, part sacrificial altar. These were the grav tithe engines. They did not drill or burn. They latched onto the crust of Viridia and pulled. The ground buckled. The plains split open in chasms 1,000 miles long. The green world screamed as its skin was peeled away in continental sheets, drawn upwards into the belly of the pilgrim world. Billions of souls, still kneeling in their fields and hab blocks, were lifted into the sky along with the very ground beneath their feet. They were incinerated in the blinding light of the soul furnaces, their life essences, their faith, their very matter rendered down into the fuel that powered this unholy pilgrimage. As Viridia was unmade, the choir that echoed through the void grew louder, a crescendo of ecstatic agony that was broadcast on every Vox channel, a hymn of consumption sung by the billions of eternally faithful souls bound to the machine cathedrals of the world ship. Hundreds of light years away, at the Segmentum Solar Command Post on Car Duniash, astropathic choirmaster Eliphas knelt before the Imperium relay, his hands pressed to his temples, his sightless eyes weeping blood. The message he had received was not a coherent report, but a psychic shriek, a wave of pure, weaponized devotion layered over the death cries of an entire world. He could feel the psychic signature of the threat, and it terrified him more than any demon or tyrannid hive mind. This was not the chaotic warp stuff of the archenemy. This was Imperial faith, curdled and magnified to a monstrous, world-ending potency. It was a heresy of absolute belief. The data slates and pict captures from long-range augurs soon followed, painting a picture of cosmic horror, a moving world, a cathedral engine, trailing debris that spectral analysis confirmed were the remains of 3 other systems in the galactic hinterlands. Its trajectory was plotted by 1,000 trembling tech adepts, their calculations confirmed and reconfirmed, each result more terrifying than the last. The line of its path was an arrow, straight and unwavering, aimed at the brightest star in the galactic map. It was coming for Terra. The report, bound in the adamantium casing reserved for threats of the highest magnitude, reached the obsidian fortress of Lord Inquisitor Valerius Corda on Titan. Corda was a man who had seen 1,000 years of horror, his body a tapestry of augmetic replacements and life-extending chem infusions. He read the data slate, his ancient eyes scanning the impossible schematics of the pilgrim world, his face an unreadable mask of stone. He listened to the Vox recording of the Viridian Choir, the sound so spiritually toxic that it caused the servo skulls in his study to smoke and spark. He did not flinch, and he simply folded his hands, the knuckles gnarled and metallic, and understood this was not merely a fleet to be fought or a world to be conquered. This was an idea given form, a belief made manifest as a weapon of galactic annihilation. To fight it with guns alone would be like trying to shoot a prayer from the sky. This was a war for the soul of the Imperium itself. He activated his private comms link, the signal bypassing all normal channels, its encryption blessed by the holiest rites of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The message was sent to 3 recipients across the segmentum. To Lord Admiral Vostok of Battlefleet Corona, a command to muster every warship capable of voiding. To the Iron Council of Medusa, a request for the cold, unyielding logic of the Iron Hands. And to the Crusade fleet of Marshal Armitage of the Black Templars, a summons for warriors whose faith was a weapon, not a vulnerability. A new war had begun against an enemy that wore the face of devotion and sang hymns of damnation. From the husk of a dead agri-world, the final pilgrimage had begun, and the shadow of Sanctum Peregrinus was falling across the stars, aimed for the throne world itself. Lord Admiral Orsino Gracchus stood on the command deck of the Retribution-class battleship. Fist of Judgment. The view before him was a tapestry of cold starlight, woven with the ruby and emerald running lights of his assembled vengeance fleet. 117 warships, the pride of the Corona subsector, held their position in the void's dead silence, a perfectly arranged predator's maw waiting to snap shut. Cruisers of the Lunar and Tyrant classes formed the solid teeth of his battle line, their flanks guarded by the swift Dauntless-class light cruisers. A screen of Cobra and Sword-class destroyers fanned out ahead, their Auspex arrays sweeping the unstable energies of the Lethe system's Mandeville Point. Gracchus was a man carved from granite and stubborn pride, his face a roadmap of 100 campaigns. He had broken Orc Waz, scattered Drukhari pirate fleets, and purged Chaos Reavers from a dozen systems. This pilgrim world, as the Astropathic Dispatch had so hysterically termed it, would be just another blasphemy to be scoured from the Emperor's stars. Augurs report warp tide fluctuations consistent with a massive entity emergence, his flag captain Rykard announced, his voice a calm baritone amplified by the bridge's voxmitters. Time to emergence estimated at 27 seconds. All vessels load Nova cannons, prepare full broadside solutions. On my mark, we will greet this heresy with the God Emperor's own divine light, Gracchus commanded, his voice rumbling with the certainty of overwhelming firepower. A chorus of affirmations clicked across the command channel as 100 ship spirits awoke to the promise of war. The bridge hummed with contained energy. Tech priests chanted their litanies of activation, their mechadendrites a blur of activity across the holy consoles. Gunnery servitors, lobotomized and hardwired into the ship's weapon systems, awaited the final synaptic command to unleash hell. This was the Imperial Navy at its finest, a precise, disciplined instrument of annihilation. The void did not so much open as it was torn. Reality fractured, screaming in protest as Sanctum Peregrinus clawed its way back into the Materium. It did not emerge gracefully. It arrived like a body breaching the surface of a black ocean, trailing ribbons of unreal light and impossible geometries. The scale of it was obscene. It dwarfed Gracchus's battleship. It dwarfed his entire fleet. The augur arrays shrieked, their logic engines struggling to quantify a single object with the mass of a planet and the energy signature of a small star. The pict captures that resolved on the main screen showed not the pitted gray of a rogue world, but the impossible Baroque architecture of a continent-spanning house of worship, glowing with internal holy light. And then came the sound. It flooded the Vox channels first, a low, sonorous hum that bypassed all frequency locks. It was the chant of billions, a choir that spoke not of desperation or rage, but of rapturous, unending joy. Then it bled through the hull, not as a vibration, but as a feeling, a pressure on the soul. On the bridge of the fist of judgment, hardened voidsmen found themselves transfixed. A junior officer made the sign of the Aquila, his eyes welling with tears. Gracchus felt it too, a strange, cloying warmth that sought to soothe his warrior's heart. He crushed it with cold fury. "Fire!" he roared, his command cutting through the growing wonder on the bridge. "Fire at will! Purge this obscenity!" The vengeance fleet obeyed. The Nova cannons, mounted in the prows of the cruisers and the battleship, discharged their payloads. Miniature suns, balls of contained plasma and fury, crossed the void in an instant. They struck the Pilgrim World's void shields, and the darkness was banished by detonations that should have cracked continents. The shields held. They did not flicker or buckle. They blazed with the golden visages of 1,000 Imperial saints, their beatific faces absorbing energies that could atomize fleets. Then came the broadsides, a storm of macro cannon shells, each the size of a municipal hab block, and the focused, incandescent needles of lance batteries converged on the target. The barrage was relentless, a percussive roar of destruction that pounded against the shields for a full minute. The golden light of the shields merely intensified, and the choir, impossibly, grew louder. It was then that the hymn changed. It was no longer a background hum, but the main instrument of the enemy's assault. The melody, intricate and sublime, wormed its way into the minds of the fleet's crews. It spoke of absolution, of the Emperor's love made manifest, of a final glorious pilgrimage to the foot of the golden throne. It promised an end to doubt, to fear, to the unending, bloody toil of service. It offered only bliss. On the gun deck of the cruiser, Chief Gunner Kalen, a man who had served for 60 years without flinching, lowered his targeting reticule. The face of his martyred mother, dead for a century, appeared to him in the shimmering shields of the world ship, her arms outstretched. He wept with joy and ordered his batteries to stand down, turning his bolt pistol on the political officer who dared to question his devotion. Aboard the destroyer Stalker, the entire bridge crew, from the captain to the lowest-ranking rating, began to sing along with the celestial choir, their eyes glazed over with ecstatic faith. They disengaged their engine limiters and plunged their vessel directly into the maw of one of the world ship's engine cathedrals. Their final transmission, not a scream, but a single unified cry of "Hallelujah!" Chaos erupted on the bridge of the Fist of Judgment. Captain Rykard stood frozen, a beatific smile on his face, his hand twitching towards his sidearm. The Master of Ordnance was on his knees, babbling prayers to the Pilgrim Emperor. Gracchus drew his Archaeotech pistol, a relic of a more sensible age, and shot the man in the head. The act of violence broke the spell for a moment. "Boarding parties," he bellowed, seeing a dozen of his own bridge crew turn on him, their eyes burning with the light of new, terrible faith. "Repel boarders on the command deck. Seditionists will be shot." The loyal members of the bridge crew, those with stronger wills or whose minds were too rigid to accept the hymn's poison, formed a ragged circle around their admiral, their lasguns firing into the faces of their former comrades. The fleet was tearing itself apart. Ships broadcasting the hymn turned their guns on those that were still fighting. The cruiser Iron Duke was gutted not by the enemy, but by a full broadside from its sister ship, the Justicar. Entire squadrons of destroyers, now flying the banner of the Pilgrim, formed a protective screen around Sanctum Peregrinus, engaging their former allies with suicidal fervor. The organized battle line of the Vengeance Fleet had dissolved into a swirling, fratricidal melee of madness and betrayal. Through this chaos, Sanctum Peregrinus acted. The colossal grappling chains Gracchus had seen in the Pict captures were unleashed, smashing through the shields of distracted Imperial ships, their immense claws piercing adamantium hulls. They did not just destroy, they captured, reeling and crippled cruisers and frigates, dragging them towards the sacrificial forge maws that gaped open on the world ship's surface. From the spires of the cathedral fortresses, lances of pure golden energy, far more powerful than anything in the Imperial arsenal, lanced out, vaporizing ships whose crews had not yet succumbed to the madness. Gracchus, his face spattered with the blood of his own officers, watched his fleet die. He saw the vigilance consumed. He saw the Iron Duke explode in a silent blossom of fire. He saw half his command turn against him, their souls lost to a heresy of beautiful lies. With a final desperate act of will, he seized the helm control from his dead captain. "All power to the engines," he screamed to the terrified engineer who was still at his post. Ramming speed. If we are to die, we die in the Emperor's fire, not in this madness. The fist of judgment. Its hull breached and its decks burning, surged forward, a wounded beast making one final charge. It aimed for the very heart of the world ship, for the central dome of the Sanctum Majoris. As it closed the distance, the hymn reached its crescendo. Gracchus felt his own iron will begin to crack. He saw visions of a peaceful galaxy, of a benevolent emperor walking amongst his people. He felt a profound sense of love emanating from the approaching world, a love that made his entire life of war and sacrifice feel like a foolish, pointless waste. For a heart-stopping second, he understood the allure. He understood the promise. Then, with a snarl of pure, undiluted hatred for the weakness he felt, he pushed the engine throttles past their limits. The ship screamed in protest. He never reached his target. A dozen of the golden lances converged on the battleship, peeling its armor away like fruit from a rind. The bridge exploded, its viewport shattering and venting the last loyal souls into the void. The final transmission from the Lord Admiral was not a curse or a prayer. It was a single choked sob of horrified understanding as the beautiful, damning truth of the hymn finally claimed him. Then silence. The vengeance fleet was no more. Sanctum Peregrinus, now attended by a small cohort of captured fanatical warships, continued its inexorable journey towards the throne world, its choir enriched by the souls of 117 crews, its path cleared of the first guardians of the Imperium. The Aegis-class data crypt on Titan was a place beyond sound, a vault where information was the only currency, and silence was the highest form of security. Here, beneath the martial splendor of the inquisitorial fortress, Lord Inquisitor Valerius Corda reviewed the last fragmented data screams of the Vengeance fleet. He watched ghostly pit captures of Imperial cruisers turning on one another, their hulls still bearing the Aquila as they fired into their brethren. He listened to the Vox logs, the crisp naval discipline of Lord Admiral Gracchus's fleet devolving into a babble of ecstatic prayer, fratricidal orders, and finally, the soul-stealing hymn itself. The recording had been psychically sanitized by a cadre of Ordo Malleus scholars, yet Corda could still feel the faint, saccharine stain of its power clinging to the airless data. He did not rage. He did not despair. Corda was an entity of pure, cold pragmatism, a faculty honed over a millennium of confronting the slow decay of the Imperium. This was not a foe to be met with righteous fury alone. That was the mistake Gracchus had made. This was a conceptual threat, a weaponized ideology. To fight it required not just ships and guns, but a carefully selected triumvirate of philosophies and an unholy alliance forged for a holy purpose. He turned from the glowing data slate, his augmetic eyes making a soft whirring sound as they refocused on the three figures assembled in the crypt's sterile confines. The first was a giant even by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes. Encased in black ceramite armor, every surface etched with oaths of moment and vows of faith, stood Marshal Armitage of the Black Templars. His face, visible through the deactivated field of his helmet, was a craggy landscape of scars and righteous certainty. He had not sat since his arrival, his hand resting on the pommel of a power sword that had drunk the blood of traitors for 5,000 years. To him, Sanctum Peregrinus was the ultimate blasphemy, a mockery of the very faith he embodied. It was an idol to be smashed, a false temple to be razed. His purpose here was clear. He was the sword of faith, the instrument of pure, unadulterated hatred that Corda would wield against the enemy's devotion. The second figure was a stark contrast. Where Armitage was fervent life, Archmagos Veneratus Drestan IX of the Adeptus Mechanicus was cold, calculating artifice. He stood encased in the crimson robes and gleaming cybernetics of a high-ranking priest of Mars. More than 3/4 of his body was machine, his original human face replaced by a polished brass mask with a dozen lenses for eyes, each glowing with the soft blue light of pure data. He did not see blasphemy in the reports. He saw a miracle of engineering, a world moved and sustained by forces beyond current Imperial comprehension. The grav-tithe engines, the soul furnaces, the continent-spanning architecture. It was a symphony of forbidden knowledge, a data set of unimaginable value. Corda had summoned him not for his piety, but for his cold logic and his command over the vast arcane fleets of the Mechanicus. He was the mind, the scalpel to dissect the enemy's impossible workings. Within his delegation, Hidden behind the hulking forms of Praetorian combat servitors were the silent, brooding shapes of the Iron Hands. Corda had specifically requested them. He needed warriors for whom logic was armor and emotion a flaw to be purged. They would be immune to the siren song of the pilgrim world. The third and final commander stood by the central hollow table, his aged frame held ramrod straight in the immaculate white and gold uniform of a Lord Admiral of Battlefleet Corona. Lord Admiral Orso Vostok was a relic, a man whose career had peaked a century ago. He had been pulled from a ceremonial retirement on Mundi, his face a mask of weary disbelief. Gracchus had been his protege, his hand-picked successor. The destruction of the Vengeance fleet was a personal, soul-crushing blow. Yet, within him burned the cold fire of a naval genius who had forgotten more about void warfare than most officers ever learned. He knew the star currents and warp routes of the entire sector like the back of his own wrinkled hand. Corda needed his experience, his knowledge of the terrain, but more than that, he needed his grief. Vostok's heart was now armored in loss. There was no room in it for the false promises of an ecstatic choir. He was the anchor, the strategist who would marshal the disparate forces into a coherent weapon. The threat is existential, Corda began, his voice a dry rasp, devoid of emotion. He gestured to the hololith, which now displayed the projected path of Sanctum Peregrinus. A red line cut through a dozen systems, each marked for consumption. It does not conquer. It does not corrupt in the traditional sense. It consumes and it converts. The psychic plague it broadcasts is not chaotic. It is a perversion of our own imperial creed, amplified to a degree that it can overwhelm the unprepared mind. Lord Admiral Gracchus and his fleet proved this, at the cost of their lives and souls. Marshal Armitage slammed a gauntleted fist onto the adamantium table, the impact echoing like a thunderclap in the silent crypt. It is a corruption of the highest order, a mockery of the Emperor's light. My Templars will board this world ship and tear its apostate cardinal from his throne. We will purify its halls with blade and fire. Give us the ships, Lord Inquisitor, and we shall grant you its heart. Archmagos Dristan IX emitted a series of clicking binary canticles, a sound of polite disagreement. An emotional response, Marshal, illogical. The entity's energy shielding absorbed a full fleet's barrage without degradation. To attempt a boarding action before neutralizing this shield is to commit resources to an equation with a zero probability of success. The primary objective must be to understand and disable the power source of the shield and by extension the psychic choir. The vessel's mechanics are the key. Lord Admiral Vostok traced a withered finger across the projected path. Its course is direct, but its speed is ponderous by naval standards. It must refuel. The reports from Viridia indicate a full planetary consumption. It is heading for the Praxis system, Praxis Secundus. His eyes narrowed. A fortress-class industrial world, rich in promethium, adamantium, and population. A perfect fuel source. It is our only viable choke point. If we cannot stop it there, we will not stop it at all. Correct, Lord Admiral, Corda affirmed, a flicker of approval in his augmetic gaze, which is why you will command the newly christened Aegis Armada. Battlefleet Corona's remaining assets are yours, bolstered by 3 full expeditionary fleets from the Iron Hands and their suzerain forge worlds. Archmagos, your Scutarii legions and the ships of the Lathe worlds will provide close support and technological acumen. Marshal, your entire crusade fleet will form the tip of our spear. Corda paused, letting the weight of his command settle in the chamber. He was asking these men, these disparate, often conflicting powers of the Imperium, to work as one. He was asking the zealot to heed the logician, the tech priest to serve alongside the warrior monk, and the grieving admiral to command them all. It was a volatile, dangerous alliance. The strategy is threefold, the Inquisitor continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. First, Admiral Vostok, you will engage and pin Sanctum Peregrinus in the Praxis system. You will use the system's asteroid fields and gas giants to your advantage. Your objective is not to destroy it in a frontal assault, but to hold it, to bleed its outer defenses, and to force its master to reveal its capabilities. Second, Archmagos Dristan, your task is to analyze the energy signatures of its shields and its psychic choir. You must find a weakness, a frequency, a flaw in its blasphemous design that we can exploit. Third, Marshal Armitage, you will bide your time. You are my mailed fist, and I will not waste your strength against an impenetrable wall. But when the Archmagos finds a crack in that wall, you will lead the assault that will break this pilgrim world. You will be the Emperor's fury given form. He looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering, demanding their assent. It was an order, not a request, backed by the full weight of the holy ordos of the Inquisition. Vostok gave a stiff, formal nod, his course of action clear. Dristan Nanine's lenses pulsed in acknowledgement, the logic of the plan deemed acceptable. Armitage stood silent for a long moment, his jaw tight. The idea of waiting, of engaging in strategy instead of a glorious, headlong charge, chafed at his very soul. But he saw the cold, undeniable truth in the Inquisitor's plan. Faith alone had not been enough to save the Vengeance fleet. It must be tempered with strategy, aimed by logic. "We shall be your fist, Lord Inquisitor," the Marshal rumbled at last, "and when we strike, the heavens themselves shall tremble." With that, the alliance was sealed. In the orbital shipyards of a dozen worlds, the call went out. Fleets disengaged from other war zones, their missions abandoned. Crusade banners were unfurled. Skitarii legions marched into the cavernous holds of their transport ships. On Medusa, the sons of the Gorgon cleansed their weapons in the sacred oils, their minds already focused on the coming storm. Under the grim, watchful eyes of Lord Inquisitor Corda, the greatest armada the sector had seen in a millennium began to gather, its destination the unsuspecting industrial world of Praxis Secundus. The unholy alliance was armed, its purpose set. All that remained was to sail into the path of the approaching God machine and offer themselves as the final bastion against the pilgrimage of the damned. Praxis Secundus was a world forged in the crucible of industry, a jewel of the Adeptus Mechanicus that shone not with natural beauty, but with the tireless glow of a billion forges. Its surface was a continuous, continent-spanning cityscape of manufactorums, smelting plants, and hive sprawls, all interconnected by a lattice of magnetic rails and promethium pipelines. Its skies, perpetually shrouded in a gray-brown haze of holy smog, were thick with the traffic of heavy lifters and cargo haulers, a testament to the unceasing production that supplied arms and armor to 100 Imperial Guard regiments. The world did not sleep. It merely changed shifts. Its people were hardy, soot-stained, and devout in the manner of those who see the Emperor's divinity in the roar of a plasma furnace and the precise function of a well-oiled machine. They were the beating industrial heart of the Praxis sector, and they were utterly oblivious to the sanctified apocalypse bearing down upon them. The Aegis Armada arrived not as a triumphant host, but as a silent, grim-faced wave of dark iron and gray ceramite. Lord Admiral Vostok's flagship, the Star of Terra, an ancient Emperor-class battleship that had served since the Macarian Crusade, took its station in the system's outer dark, a brooding leviathan flanked by the cold, functional lines of the Iron Hands strike cruisers. Marshal Armitage's fleet, a collection of Baroque, relic-strewn vessels led by the Eternal Crusader, Sigismund's legacy, formed the second line, their chapels already lit with the fires of pre-battle rites. The Mechanicus flotilla under Archmagos Dristan Nanine, a bizarre menagerie of Arch Mechanicus vessels and Gothic warships, took up a trailing position, their powerful augur arrays already turning towards the system's edge, thirsty for data. Vostok's plan, born from a lifetime of voidcraft, was one of grinding, bloody-minded attrition. He would not meet the pilgrim world in the open void. Instead, he turned the entire Praxis system into a layered killing field. The outer asteroid belt, a treacherous chaos of spinning rock and ice, was seeded with thousands of vortex mines and plasma charges, each sanctified by Dristan's tech priests. The gas giant, Praxis Major, a swirling behemoth of violent storms, would be used as a gravitational anchor for hit-and-run attacks, its immense magnetic field providing a screen against augur sweeps. The final line of defense was Praxis Secundus itself. Its orbital defense platforms, great star forts bristling with lance batteries and torpedo tubes, were crewed by the stoic Skitarii legions, their cold machine logic impervious to the enemy's psychic song. On the planet below, the gears of war began to turn. The Praxian Skitarii, led by the iron-willed Alpha Primus 7 Griffin, reinforced every major orbital defense laser and void shield generator. The local PDF, though bewildered by the sudden arrival of a fleet that dwarfed their own, was mobilized to guard key infrastructure, their hearts filled with a mix of terror and awe. There was no grand announcement, no call to arms for the general populace. To do so would be to invite panic. Vostok and Korda, who monitored the proceedings from a secure Vox link aboard the Star of Terra, knew that fear was a gateway to the very faith plague they sought to fight. The people of Praxis would know they were at war only when the sky above their smog-choked cities began to burn. Sanctum Peregrinus arrived precisely when and where Vostok's astromancers had predicted. It translated from the warp with the same reality-tearing violence as before, its continent-sized cathedrals eclipsing the distant sun, and with it came the hymn. It washed over the Aegis Armada, a wave of sublime, treacherous beauty. But this time, the fleet was prepared. Aboard every vessel, librarians of the Iron Hands and chaplains of the Black Templars wove psychic wards and recited litanies of hatred, their words a bulwark against the siren's call. The Mechanicus ships broadcast a dissonant, screeching data hymn of pure logic, a counter-frequency that grated on the soul but shielded the mind from emotional manipulation. The fleet held. A few smaller vessels, their crews' resolve faltering, wavered for a moment, but the swift, merciless execution of their captains by embedded inquisitorial stormtroopers brought them back in line. The first test came in the asteroid field. As Sanctum Peregrinus plowed forward, its immense gravitic pull dragging smaller planetoids in its wake, Vostok gave the command. Detonate the outer cordon. A chain of silent, blinding flashes lit up the void as the vortex mines tore holes in reality itself. Asteroids the size of moons were shredded, their fragments sucked into the swirling non-space of the warp. The Pilgrim World's void shields flared, the faces of the saints shimmering as they absorbed the raw, unleashed power of the Imperium. The shields held, but Dristan's augurs registered a momentary, fractional power dip. It was the first wound, however slight, that had been dealt to the beast. Data captured, the Archmagos transmitted, his voice a synthesized monotone. The shield emitters are cycling through harmonic frequencies. There is a pattern. It is inefficient. It is flawed. Encouraged, Vostok sprung the next phase of his trap. From the swirling cloud cover of Praxis Major, squadrons of Dauntless-class cruisers surged forward, their Nova cannons spitting fire before they retreated back into the gas giant's magnetic shadow. It was a classic tactic of naval harassment, designed to vex and bleed a larger foe. But Sanctum Peregrinus did not react like a conventional warship. It did not turn to give chase or return fire with its main batteries. Instead, its attendant fleet of converted Imperial warships, the martyred remnants of the Vengeance fleet, surged forward. Their hulls were now covered in crude, zealous script, their weapons firing with a fanatical disregard for their own safety. They engaged Vostok's cruisers in a series of brutal, close-range brawls amidst the swirling clouds of the gas giant. The war for Praxis had begun in earnest. For 3 days, a grinding, attritional battle raged across the system. In the void, Imperial ships dueled with their fallen brethren, the cold professionalism of the Navy clashing with the suicidal zeal of the converted. On the surface of Praxis Secundus, the first signs of the world ship's influence began to manifest. The hymn, though blocked from the fleet, seeped down into the planet's atmosphere. Cults, nascent and feverish, sprung up in the underhives. Workers laid down their tools, their faces turned to the sky, singing praises to the new approaching star that promised salvation from their life of endless toil. Korda's agents and the local Arbites began a brutal, silent purge, but it was like trying to stamp out a fire that was being fed by an ocean of oil. The true crucible, however, was in orbit. Sanctum Peregrinus, ignoring the harassing fleet actions, continued its slow, inexorable advance towards the industrial world. It reached the final line of defense, the ring of orbital starforts. The Skitarii garrisons, their minds unburdened by doubt, opened fire. Beams of energy thick as towers lanced out from the platforms, striking the world ship's shields with titanic force. The choir intensified, its psychic power focused now not on conversion, but on pure destruction. Waves of raw emotional force, the focused adoration of a billion souls, slammed into the starforts. Adamantium walls groaned, and void shields, designed to repel torpedoes, flickered under the assault of a weaponized prayer. Then, the grav-tithe engines descended, not towards the planet, but towards the orbital platforms. Colossal chains and grappling claws, each one a fortress in its own right, reached out for the bastions of the Mechanicus. The Scutarii fought with cold fury, their radium carbines and plasma calivers incinerating the swarms of servitor cherubs and lobotomized zealots that were launched from the Pilgrim World. Alpha Primus 7 Griffin personally led the defense of the primary command station, his transuranic arquebus felling blasphemous constructs with every logical, calculated shot. But they were fighting against a world. For every chain they severed with lascutters, 3 more took its place. The starfort designated Omega 7 was the first to fall. Grappled and held fast, it was torn from its orbital moorings and dragged, guns still blazing defiantly, towards the gaping forge maws of Sanctum Peregrinus. Its last transmission was not a scream or a plea for aid, but a single unwavering burst of binary, a final report on the enemy's structural integrity. The loss of Omega 7 was a blow, but it had bought time. Time for Dristan's logic engines to churn through the data, to analyze the shield frequencies, to find the flaw. And as the battle for the heavens raged, a coded message was sent from the Archmagos' flagship to the Sigismund's legacy. It was a single complex data string, a set of coordinates, and a time signature. Aboard his battle barge, surrounded by his roaring Templars, Marshal Armitage read the message. A savage grin split his scarred face. The logicians had found a crack in the false temple's walls. Now it was time for the faithful to bring it crashing down. The assault began not with a roar, but with the silent prayer of 1,000 warrior monks. Aboard the Sigismund's legacy and a score of Black Templar strike cruisers, the boarding rituals were underway. In cavernous chapels of wrath, the air was thick with the scent of sacred incense and weapons-grade lubricants. Neophytes painted their armor with symbols of hatred, their young faces taut with a mixture of terror and exultation. Veteran sword brethren, their battle plates scarred by centuries of unending war, knelt before their chaplains, renewing vows to despise the witch, the alien, and the heretic. At their head, Marshal Armitage stood before the Reclusium's central altar, upon which rested a shard of bone from the hand of Sigismund himself. He did not pray for victory. Victory was an inevitability granted by the Emperor. He prayed for the strength to enact the righteous slaughter that was his sacred duty. Their target was a structure of obscene scale and blasphemous purpose, designated Chapel Thruster Primus Alpha. It was one of a dozen such continent-sized engine cathedrals that provided the Pilgrim World's primary propulsion. According to Archmagos Drystan's analysis, it was more than just a drive system. It was a focal point for the world ship's void shields. During its firing cycle, a microsecond-long harmonic flaw appeared in the shield's energy matrix, a keyhole in the fortress walls. To strike it would require a teleportation assault of unprecedented scale and precision, a feat most commanders would deem suicidal. For Marshal Armitage, it was merely the Emperor's will made manifest. "The logicians of Mars have given us our path," he bellowed, his voice echoing from the ship's Vox amplifiers, reaching every Templar in the assault force. "It is a path through the belly of the beast. We will tread the halls of this false temple, and we will tear down its gilded idols. We will silence its choir with the song of our bolters. For the Emperor and Sigismund, no pity, no remorse, no fear." A thunderous roar of assent answered him, a wave of zealous fury that shook the very deck plates of the battle barge. 10,000 Black Templars, the assembled might of 3 crusading fleets, were ready to be unleashed. In the void, the battle for the orbital platforms raged on, a calculated sacrifice orchestrated by Lord Admiral Vostok. He had committed his ships to a furious, close-range engagement, drawing the attention of Sanctum Peregrinus and its converted fleet. Lance batteries seared through the darkness, and macro-cannon shells hammered against shields, a maelstrom of destruction designed to mask the imminent teleport strike. Vostok watched the hololith, his face a grim mask. He was sending 10,000 of the Emperor's finest angels into the heart of hell on the word of a machine priest's algorithm. It was the greatest gamble of his long career. As the Chapel Thruster began its next firing cycle, its immense cherub-mouthed exhaust glowing with the light of a captive star, Dristan's signal came. A single screeching burst of binary. It was the only signal that mattered. Aboard the Templar fleet, 1,000 tech marines slammed their fists down on activation runes. The air in the teleportarium chambers crackled, turning the color of ozone and rage. The world dissolved into a blinding flash of white light and a wrenching, non-physical translocation. The Black Templars rematerialized not in a sterile engine room, but in a place of horrific divine madness. They were inside the chapel thruster, standing on a nave floor miles long, paved with polished obsidian that reflected the tormented light of the engine's core. The ceiling, lost in the cavernous heights above, was a Gothic nightmare of vaulted arches and flying buttresses, from which hung censers the size of drop pods, belching clouds of intoxicating, psychically active smoke. The very walls were alive, composed of the fused, screaming forms of countless souls, their faces and limbs writhing in a silent, eternal chorus of ecstatic praise. The air thrummed with the hymn of ascension, no longer a distant song, but a physical, crushing presence that sought to buckle the knees and fill the heart with suicidal adoration. Their enemy was not a crew of voidsmen or a legion of Scutarii. It was the living embodiment of the world ship's faith. From the shadowed alcoves and side chapels emerged the procession of the beatified. These were the former clergy and population of Sanctus Zealous, their bodies warped and remade by their insane devotion. Some were hulking brutes, their flesh swollen with zealous fury, their arms replaced with great stone hammers taken from the cathedral walls. Others were lithe and terrifyingly fast, their faces serene masks of bliss as they brandished sacrificial knives and censers filled with soul fire. Leading them were the Pontifex Guard, their power armor fused with relics and holy scriptures, their helmets melted into the shape of weeping saints, their bolters firing not shells but shards of solidified, wrathful prayer. "Heretics!" Armitage roared, the sound a clarion call of pure hatred that cut through the psychic miasma. He activated his power sword, its blade humming with a lethal energy field. "Purge them all!" The battle that followed was not a battle. It was an exorcism enacted with bolt gun and chainsword. The Templars formed a solid shield wall, their bolters spitting explosive death into the oncoming tide of fanatics. The heretics died with prayers on their lips, their bodies torn apart by the mass reactive shells, their faces still locked in expressions of beatific joy. The Pontifex Guard met the charge of the Sword Brethren in a clash of ceramite and faith. Power swords met sanctified Crozius axes, the air crackling with the discharge of their opposing energies. Marshal Armitage was a whirlwind of destruction at the heart of the maelstrom. He carved a bloody path through the procession, his ancient blade shearing through mutated flesh and heretical armor with equal ease. A giant hammer-wielding zealot charged him, its face a mask of rapturous devotion. Armitage sidestepped the blow that cracked the obsidian floor, and with a single upward stroke, vivisected the creature from groin to sternum. He was not just a warrior, he was an icon of defiance, a living refutation of the world ship's corrupting faith. Every heretic he slew was a prayer of hatred, every swing of his sword a litany of denial. But the sheer weight of numbers was overwhelming. For every fanatic the Templars cut down, 2 more emerged from the shadowed archways. The psychic pressure was immense. Neophytes, their minds less hardened than the veterans, began to falter. One fell to his knees, his bolter clattering to the floor, his eyes wide with a horrifying, dawning comprehension of the hymn's promise. Before the heresy could take root, his squad's chaplain brought a thunderhammer down on his helmet, a brutal act of mercy. They were losing ground, the black-armored shield wall being forced back, inch by bloody inch, towards the teleportation zone. The assault was on the verge of failure. It was then that High Marshal Helbrecht's vow echoed in Armitage's mind. Suffer not the works of the heretic to live. This was not a fortress to be captured. It was a temple to be desecrated. "Emperor's champion," Armitage roared over the Vox. "To me, we strike the heart." From the ranks of the Sword Brethren, a lone figure emerged, Brother Valerius, the chosen champion for this crusade, his armor gleaming silver, his black sword held in a 2-handed grip. He was an avatar of the Emperor's wrath. Together, he and Armitage led a desperate, suicidal charge, breaking from the shield wall and plunging directly into the heart of the enemy horde. They ignored the lesser fanatics, their focus absolute. Their target was the far end of the nave, where the engine's core pulsed behind a shimmering veil of energy, tended to by a circle of tech cardinals, their bodies grotesquely fused with the machinery of the thruster. They became a spear of righteous fury, a black and silver blur of death. Sword brethren followed in their wake, forming a flying wedge that carved deep into the heretic ranks. They reached the altar-like control pulpit of the engine core. The tech cardinals turned, their mechadendrites lashing out like serpents, firing bolts of raw, unholy energy. The Emperor's champion met them, his black sword a vortex of silver light, deflecting shots and severing corrupted cybernetics with every flawless movement. Armitage ignored the priests. He raised his own combi melta to his shoulder, the weapon's twin barrels glowing with imminent fury. He aimed it at the pulsating heart of the engine core itself, the source of the chapel's unholy power. He pulled the trigger. A lance of pure thermal rage erupted from the melta, crossing the chancel in an instant. It struck the energy veil, which flared and died. The beam hit the core mechanism, a sphere of captured plasma and screaming souls. There was no grand explosion. Instead, the hymn faltered. The light in the cathedral sputtered, and the very walls seemed to groan in agony. The engine, mortally wounded, began to shudder, its cycle collapsing into a chaotic, destructive cascade. "We are done here," Armitage bellowed, his voice ringing with savage triumph. "Templars, withdraw to the extraction point! Withdraw!" As the Astartes began their fighting retreat, the chapel thruster began to tear itself apart. Gouts of plasma erupted from the walls, incinerating heretic and Templar alike. The ceiling cracked, raining down debris the size of land speeders. The pilgrim world shuddered, a wounded giant lurching in the void. The Black Templars teleported out in waves, their numbers grievously depleted, but their mission accomplished. They left behind a ruined, collapsing cathedral and the silenced choir of a dying engine. In the void, one of the dozen burning stars that propelled Sanctum Peregrinus sputtered, flickered, and died, leaving a trail of wreckage and frozen souls in its wake. The beast had been wounded. For the first time, it had been made to bleed. High in the Sanctum Majoris, the central, world-spanning basilica of Sanctum Peregrinus, Cardinal Ignatius Roth felt the death of the chapel thruster not as a vibration, but as a stabbing pain in his soul. He sat upon the throne of beatific agony, a construct of gold, ivory, and the petrified bones of the first martyrs of his glorious pilgrimage. His body was a withered, frail thing, lost within the crimson vastness of his robes, but his mind was a raging star. Through a network of psychoconductive conduits and nerve jacks, he was one with his world ship. He felt its every function, heard the prayers of its every bound soul, and directed its celestial course through the sheer, focused power of his faith. The Templars' assault had been a mortal wound, a desecration that sent a shockwave of spiritual agony through his entire being. His sanctum was a cavern of impossible dimensions. Stained glass windows 100 miles high depicted his own ascension, casting shards of colored light across a floor polished to a mere sheen. Floating servo-cherubs, their faces frozen in expressions of beatific rapture, chanted his personal litanies. Yet now, for the first time, there was a discordant note in the endless symphony of praise, a tremor of doubt, a flicker of silence where 1,000,000 souls had once sung in unison. The Imperial fleet, emboldened by this small victory, was pressing its attack, their ships surging forward from the shadow of the gas giant, their weapons finding new temporary weaknesses in the flickering void shields. Rage, cold and pure, unlike the warm, all-consuming love he usually felt, filled Cardinal Roth. He had offered these lost sheep salvation. He had shown them the glorious final truth of the Imperial Creed, a truth of ascension through consumption, of unity through absorption. He was leading them all on the final, greatest pilgrimage to the feet of the Emperor on Terra, to offer up a galaxy of faith and matter, to rejuvenate their dying god, and they had answered his gift with bolter shells and melta-blasts. They were not merely misguided. They were blasphemers of the highest order clinging to the dead, static corpse of a faith he sought to set ablaze. "They do not understand the glory of our purpose," he whispered, his voice a dry rustle of dead leaves, yet it boomed across the Sanctum Majoris, amplified by vox emitters shaped like the mouths of angels. "They see a monster where they should see a savior. They hear a threat where they should hear a hymn of welcome. So be it. If they will not accept our love, then they shall be shattered by its magnificence." He reached out with his mind, his consciousness sinking deep into the core of his worldship, past the soul furnaces and the relic drives, to the very heart of his power, the choir of ascension. This was not merely the collective psychic noise of the consumed, it was a weapon, a carefully constructed psychic instrument housed in a spherical cathedral, miles in diameter, located at the very center of the planetoid. Here, the most psychically potent and spiritually pure souls captured from a dozen worlds were held in a state of perpetual, agonizing rapture. Their combined emotional and spiritual output was focused, refined, and amplified through colossal psychoacoustic pillars of wraithbone-like crystal, forming a wave of deified madness that could be unleashed upon the void. He had been using it as a passive aura, a gentle call to the faithful. Now he would use it as a sword. "Let the grand chorus sing," Cardinal Roth commanded, his frail hands gripping the arms of his throne. "Let the heavens hear the true voice of faith." Aboard the Star of Terra, Lord Admiral Vostok watched the pit captures with a grim sense of satisfaction. The enemy world ship was listing, its course wavering. The death of one of its engines had caused a noticeable degradation in its shields. "All squadrons, concentrate fire on the wounded quadrant," he ordered, his voice crisp and clear. "Press the advantage. They are bleeding." It was in that moment of triumph that the attack came. It was not a lance strike or a torpedo volley. It was a wave of pure, concentrated emotion that rolled out from Sanctum Peregrinus, visible even to the naked eye as a shimmer of golden, ethereal light. It washed over the Aegis Armada, and this time there was no resisting it. The psychic wards of the Librarians shattered like glass. The litanies of hatred of the Templar chaplains were choked in their throats, replaced by gasps of awestruck wonder. The cold, logical data hymns of the Mechanicus were drowned out by a melody of such impossible, heartbreaking beauty that it overloaded logic circuits and crashed cogitator banks. The chorus of ascension did not seek to convert. It sought to overwhelm. It bypassed the rational mind entirely and struck directly at the soul. It showed every crewman, from the lowest indentured rating to the highest-ranking officer, a vision of their own personal paradise, a galaxy where their every sacrifice had been worthwhile, where the Emperor's dream was a reality. They saw worlds at peace, families reunited, a final glorious end to the endless war. And they were shown that this paradise was attainable, that it was waiting for them, that the pilgrim world was the key, the vessel that would carry them all to that final blissful shore. On the bridge of the strike cruiser Iron Resolve, the Iron Hands Captain Quarren, a warrior whose emotional inhibitors were the pride of his chapter, found himself weeping. He saw a vision of the Gorgon, Ferrus Manus, alive and whole, welcoming him into the halls of Medusa, praising him for his logic and his service. The captain turned to his bridge crew, his metallic face contorted in an unfamiliar expression of pure joy. "The Omnissiah. He has shown us the path," he declared, his voice thick with emotion. He ordered his vessel to turn, its guns targeting the nearby black Templar battle barge. "The flesh is weak, but the spirit is enlightened for the true pilgrimage." Chaos, absolute and immediate, consumed the Aegis Armada. A full third of the fleet, their crews lost in the rapturous visions of the chorus, turned on their allies. The disciplined battle lines Vostok had so carefully constructed dissolved into a frantic, swirling melee of fratricidal carnage. The Iron Resolve slammed a full torpedo salvo into the flank of the Sigismund's Legacy, which reeled from the unexpected point-blank assault. The lunar-class cruiser, Dominion, its crew singing the hymn of the pilgrim world in joyous unison, unleashed its full broadside on Vostok's own flagship. Void shields screamed and buckled under the friendly fire. Adamantium hulls were breached by macro cannon shells bearing the sigil of the Imperial Navy. Lord Admiral Vostok watched the unfolding catastrophe, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. His own bridge was a scene of pandemonium. Officers were shooting each other, some screaming in horror, others with tears of joy streaming down their faces. His Vox officer was babbling about seeing his long-dead wife on the view screen. Vostok, his mind shielded by the sheer, barren emptiness of his grief, was immune. The chorus showed him a vision of his dead protege, Gracchus, smiling and beckoning him to join the pilgrimage. Vostok met the ghost's eyes and felt nothing but cold, weary disgust. He raised his pistol and shot the Vox officer, the crack of the weapon a sharp, ugly sound against the beautiful, damning music. Emergency broadcast to all loyal vessels, he roared into the command channel, his voice a gravelly anchor in the storm of madness. Disengage, disengage, scatter and regroup at the trailing rally point. This is not a battle, it is a plague. I repeat, all loyal Imperial forces, break formation and retreat. The order was anathema to a naval commander, a confession of total defeat. But it was their only hope. The remaining two-thirds of the fleet, those ships whose crews were able to fight off the psychic contagion through sheer force of will or the brutal intervention of their commissars and chaplains, began a chaotic, desperate withdrawal. They were harried at every turn by their former comrades, whose attacks were frenzied and suicidal, their ships charging headlong into their allies, their guns firing until their reactors overloaded. Archmagos Dristan-9's vessel, the Arch Mechanicus Cog of Eternity, was one of the few ships completely unaffected, its crew of Scutarii and tech priests, too divorced from human emotion to be swayed. But its logical perfection made it a primary target for the newly converted fanatics. Surrounded by three cruisers that had once been its protectors, the Archmagos coolly calculated the odds of survival at less than 7%. He did not panic. He simply diverted all power to his auger arrays, recording every microsecond of the chorus's psychic wave, analyzing its structure, its frequency, its devastating, beautiful architecture. Even in the face of annihilation, the acquisition of data was the only thing that mattered. The shattering chorus, as it would later be known, had broken the Aegis Armada. Vostok's grand strategy lay in ruins, his fleet a shattered, scattered remnant, fleeing into the dark. Sanctum Peregrinus, its shields now fully restored, its choir singing a triumphant, terrible hymn, slowly began to right its course. It had suffered a wound, but in response it had unleashed a weapon that had turned the Imperium's own strength against itself, transforming a disciplined armada into a self-immolating mob of true believers. The path to Praxis Secundus was now clear. The last bastion had fallen, not to superior firepower, but to a promise of heaven that delivered only hell. The Cog of Eternity survived. It did so not through martial prowess, but through a cold and perfect calculus of sacrifice. Archmagos Veneratus Dristan-9, monitoring the battle from his suspended data throne, had rerouted the ship's last reserves of power from its weapon systems to its void shields and auger arrays. He had allowed the converted Imperial cruisers to hammer at his vessel's hull, weathering a storm of macro-cannon shells and lance strikes that would have crippled any lesser ship. Each impact was a variable in a grand equation, each energy reading a precious line of code. While the fleet broke around him, Dristan was utterly absorbed in the contemplation of the enemy's magnificent, terrible weapon. The shattering chorus was not merely a psychic assault, it was a marvel of psychoacoustic engineering, a waveform of such complexity and elegance that it represented a quantum leap in the understanding of the Imperium. It was, to his machine-augmented mind, the most beautiful thing he had ever encountered. He had recorded it all. Terabytes of raw, unfiltered data poured into the Cog of Eternity's logic engines, detailing the chorus's harmonic structure, its emotional resonance, and the precise frequencies that bypassed conventional psychic defenses. It was knowledge beyond price, a key that could potentially unlock the very secrets of faith itself. And as the crippled Aegis Armada limped away, a horrifying, heretical thought began to form in the Archmagos' positronic brain. Such a creation could not be simply destroyed. It must be studied, it must be understood, it must, if possible, be preserved. The thought was a logical imperative, as clean and cold as a theorem, and it would damn a sector. The remnants of the Loyalist fleet regrouped in the shadow of a barren moon on the edge of the Praxis system. It was a ghost of the Grand Armada that had arrived with such purpose. Lord Admiral Vostok's command deck on the Star of Terra was a scene from a charnel house, the bodies of mutinous officers still littering the floor. Of the 300 warships that had formed the Aegis Armada, fewer than 100 remained under his command. Another 100 were now a fanatical escort for the Pilgrim World, their hulls already being adorned with crude, idolatrous script. The rest were silent, drifting hulks, monuments to the bloody cost of the chorus. Marshal Armitage's Black Templars had suffered the least from the psychic attack, their ironclad faith in the fury of their recent battle insulating them, but their fleet had been savaged by the betrayal of their former Iron Hands allies. The Marshal paced the bridge of the Sigismund's legacy, his rage a palpable force, a simmering volcano of hatred for the traitor and the heretic alike. A council of war was convened via the flickering, unstable connection of the astropathic network. Vostok's face was a mask of gray, weary defeat. Armitage's was a thundercloud of fury. But it was Drystanai's synthesized voice that cut through the recriminations and despair. The engagement has yielded critical data, the Archmagos stated, his tone as placid as if he were discussing metallurgical reports. The enemy's primary psychic weapon, designated Chorus of Ascension, operates on a multi-layered harmonic frequency. It is potent, yet my analysis reveals a significant flaw. It requires a vast amount of energy to project on a fleet-wide scale. The entity, Sanctum Peregrinus, is now venting plasma and psychic residue. Its power reserves are depleted. It is vulnerable. A flicker of hope ignited in Vostok's tired eyes. Vulnerable? How? Its shields are still active. The shield matrix is intrinsically linked to the chorus projector and the remaining chapel thrusters, Dristan explained. My logic engines have developed a precise firing solution, a coordinated barrage targeting 11 specific architectural junctures on the entity's surface simultaneously will create a resonance cascade. The effect should, theoretically, overload the entire power grid, causing a system-wide shutdown of all major functions. Shields, engines, and the chorus itself will be rendered inert. Probability of success, 87.4%. Marshal Armitage's voice boomed over the vox. Oh, weakness. Then we strike now while the beast is wounded. We will purge the traitors in our path and deliver the final blow. That is the logical course of action, Dristan agreed. He began transmitting the complex firing data to the remaining loyalist ships, a stream of calculations and coordinates that would require the full processing power of every vessel's cogitator to implement. Synchronization is paramount. The volleys must strike within a 0.05-second window to initiate the cascade. The fleet, what was left of it, began to turn. Hope, that most dangerous and treacherous of emotions, began to spread through the battered crews. They had a plan. They had a chance. Vostok, his old fire rekindled, began to issue crisp, precise orders, marshaling his ships into a new attack formation. They would charge through the screen of traitor vessels and deliver the Archmagos' miracle shot. But the data Dristan had sent was a lie. It was a beautiful, elegant, and utterly corrupt piece of code. The firing solution was almost perfect. It contained 10 of the 11 critical coordinates required to create the resonance cascade. The 11th, however, was subtly, almost imperceptibly, altered. Instead of targeting a key power conduit near the Sanctum Majoris, it targeted a redundant, heavily armored buttress 300 miles away. The shot would still cause immense damage. It would appear to be part of the coordinated plan, but it would not trigger the cascade. The overload would fail. The world ship would be wounded, perhaps even crippled, but its core systems, its shields, and the magnificent, priceless Chorus of Ascension would survive. He was not just trying to preserve a piece of technology. He was attempting to capture a god machine. As the Loyalist fleet surged forward, the traitor ships, now fully integrated into the Pilgrim World's command structure, moved to intercept them. The final desperate battle for Praxis began. The void was once again filled with the fury of broadsides and the lancing fire of energy weapons. This time it was a battle of grim-faced loyalists against joyous, singing fanatics. The Templars, leading the charge, smashed into the traitor line with unrestrained hatred, their boarding torpedoes and Thunderhawk gunships seeking to cleanse the tainted vessels with fire and steel. At the heart of the battle, Vostok watched his master plot, his tactical displays showing the fleet maneuvering into position. All vessels confirm firing solution lock, he commanded, his voice tight with anticipation. A chorus of green runes lit up his screen. Everyone was ready. Sanctum Peregrinus loomed before them, immense and terrifying, its choir now a low, menacing hum. On my mark, Vostok said, his hand hovering over the command rune. Fire! 100 ships fired as one. A storm of energy beams, plasma bursts, and nova cannon shells converged on the world ship. The 10 correct shots struck their targets with pinpoint accuracy. Entire spires crumbled. A secondary chapel exploded in a silent ball of flame. A huge gash was torn in the planetoid's crust, venting atmosphere and the ghostly shapes of 1,000,000 souls into the void. The world ship shuddered violently, its lights flickering across its continental surface. But the 11th shot, the one fired from the main gun of the Cog of Eternity itself, struck the inert buttress, sending a shower of adamantium splinters into space but doing no critical damage. There was no cascade. The system-wide shutdown did not occur. The shields, though weakened, held. The lights on Sanctum Peregrinus, after a terrifying moment of darkness, flared back to life, burning with a renewed vengeful intensity. The low hum of the choir began to rise again in pitch and power. On the bridge of the star of Terra, a horrified silence descended. The plan had failed. They had shot their bolt, and it had not been enough. Dristan's voice came over the command channel, a masterpiece of feigned surprise and mechanical regret. Recalculating. Probability error. Unknown variable detected. The entity's power grid is more resilient than projected. The plan has failed. The words struck Lord Admiral Vostok like a physical blow. Despair, absolute and crushing, extinguished the last embers of his hope. They had lost. He watched as Sanctum Peregrinus, enraged and wounded, began to move again. It ignored his shattered fleet, its prize now within reach. The grav-tithe engines, those obscene altar claws, began to descend upon the smog-choked skies of Praxis Secundus. The feast was about to begin. The betrayal, born not of malice but of a cold, heretical lust for knowledge, was complete. The cog of heresy had turned, and a world was about to be devoured as the price of its terrible logic. The fall of Praxis Secundus was not a battle. It was a harvest. As the shattered remnants of the Aegis Armada could only watch in impotent horror, Sanctum Peregrinus descended upon the industrial world like a carrion bird settling on a corpse. The grav-tithe engines, those continent-sized instruments of consumption, made landfall across the planet's most densely populated and industrialized zones. There was no subtlety, no precision. They simply latched onto the crust of the world and pulled. The hive spires of Praxis, monuments of adamantium and plasteel that had stood for millennia, groaned and buckled. Entire manufactorum districts were torn from their foundations, the screech of tortured metal audible even in the thin upper atmosphere. The planet's skin was peeled away in great 100-mile-wide strips, revealing the molten mantle beneath. Rivers of liquid promethium, a world's lifeblood, gushed from severed pipelines, igniting into firestorms that consumed the sky. The carefully constructed logical world of the Mechanicus was unmade in a chaotic geological apocalypse. For the billions of souls on the surface, the end was a terrifying spectacle of divine horror, the sky filled with the impossible upside-down architecture of the pilgrim world. The hymn, once a distant whisper, became a deafening, all-consuming reality, broadcast from 1,000,000 cathedral spires. It was the last thing they ever heard. Some fell to their knees in prayer, welcoming the rapture. Others ran in mindless panic. Their flight ended as the very ground beneath their feet was ripped upwards. They, along with their hab blocks, their forges, and their temples to the Omnissiah, were drawn into the gaping, glowing maws of the soul furnaces. There, matter, life, and faith were rendered down into the pure, incandescent energy that fueled the great pilgrimage. Praxis Secundus, the heart of a sector, was reduced to a feast, its death scream a new verse in the world ship's unending hymn. The consumption took 3 days. 3 days of methodical planetary deconstruction. When it was over, all that remained of Praxis Secundus was its incandescent molten core, a new and weeping star in the void, orbited by a cloud of superheated dust and the frozen, silent debris of its orbital platforms. Sanctum Peregrinus, its wounds repaired with the flesh of the world it had just eaten, its power reserves overflowing, its choir enriched by 100 billion new voices, resumed its catastrophic journey. The Praxis system, once a beacon of Imperial industry, was now a tomb. The trail of the pilgrim world was a scar carved across the very fabric of the segmentum solar. Its path was not random. It was a deliberate, calculated line of consumption, a chain of logistical stepping stones leading inexorably to Terra. Before Praxis, it had devoured the agri-world of Viridia. After, it fell upon the mining colonies of the Asteria belt, cracking the planetoids like nuts to feast on their mineral-rich hearts. It drained the gas giant of Clist Major, siphoning its volatile atmosphere to refuel its secondary systems. Each consumed world was a victory for the pilgrim, and another nail in the coffin of the surrounding region. A wave of refugees, a tide of human misery on a scale not seen in centuries, fled before the world ship's advance. From a dozen threatened systems, every vessel capable of interstellar travel was filled to bursting and beyond. Grand cruisers, rogue traders, and kilometer-long mass conveyors traveled alongside battered pilgrimage ships and flimsy system boats not rated for warp travel. They formed a vast, desperate exodus, a fleet of the damned running from a predator they could not comprehend. They choked the warp routes, their Geller fields flickering under the strain of so many simultaneous transits. Many never reached their destinations, their ships falling prey to the demons that haunted the Imperium, their souls lost in the sea of chaos. Others arrived at their intended safe havens, only to find them already overrun, or worse, under Imperial quarantine, their pleas for sanctuary answered by the cold, merciless fire of orbital defense batteries. The logistical strain on the Imperium was catastrophic. Lord Inquisitor Corda, now coordinating the wider war effort from his command post on Cardinal, found himself fighting a war on two fronts. The first was against the physical threat of Sanctum Peregrinus. The second was against the collapse of an entire segmentum. Worlds that were not on the Pilgrim's direct path were starving, their supply lines cut by the refugee fleets, and the Navy's desperate attempts to cordon off the affected zones. Tithes of men and material went unpaid. Astropathic communications became a chaotic babble of panicked pleas and contradictory orders. The carefully balanced, impossibly vast machine of Imperial bureaucracy was grinding to a halt, choked by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the crisis. The attrition was unimaginable, not just in lives, but in faith. The psychic echo of the Pilgrim World's passage, the lingering stain of its hymn, infected the very stars it passed. On worlds hundreds of light years from its path, cults of the final pilgrimage began to bloom in the darkness of underhives and the decadent spires of the nobility. They preached a new dynamic creed, that the Emperor was not a silent god on a golden throne, but a moving, active savior coming to deliver the faithful from the grim darkness of their reality. They saw the picked captures of the world ship not as a threat, but as a promise. The Ordo Hereticus, already stretched to its breaking point, found itself battling a pandemic of belief, a heresy that spread not through whispers and secret texts, but through a terrifying shared hope. Exterminatus became a common tool, not of last resort, but of desperate quarantine. The number of worlds silenced by cyclonic torpedoes to prevent the spread of the Ignatian faith, as it became known, was a closely guarded secret, but it numbered in the scores. Corda sat in his command sanctum, the vast hololith before him a sea of red runes and icons of planetary death. He had lost a fleet, a sector, and was now losing the battle for the hearts and minds of the Emperor's own subjects. He reviewed the data from the Praxis disaster, his augmetic eyes lingering on the flawless yet failed firing solution provided by Archmagos Dristan. The logic of it was too perfect, the failure too precise. A cold suspicion, the familiar companion of any inquisitor worth his rood, began to crystallize in his mind. He had trusted the cold logic of the Mechanicus, but he had forgotten that even a machine can hold a belief, and that the lust for knowledge can be as blinding and corrupting as any chaos god's promise. He looked at the projected path of Sanctum Peregrinus. It had now passed the point of no return. The outer defenses of the Sol system were still light years away, but there were no more fleets to throw in its path, no more fortress worlds to act as brakes. Conventional warfare had failed. Zealotry had failed. Strategy had failed. The cost of this war was already a tally of suns and civilizations, a tithe of worlds paid to a monstrous mobile altar. All that was left was to embrace the unthinkable, to fight this fire of faith not with water but with the void. A new plan, terrible and desperate, began to form in the Inquisitor's ancient mind, a plan that would require a weapon as absolute and terrifying as the one it sought to destroy. The summons from Lord Inquisitor Corda was not a request, but a seizure of assets on a scale that bordered on sacrilege. It bypassed Fleet Command, Senatorum Imperialis, and even the august councils of the Adeptus Terra. His authority, written in the secret language of the Rosette and backed by the silent threat of the Officio Assassinorum, reached into the most feared and secluded corners of the Imperium. His call was answered not by battleships bristling with guns, but by a fleet of ghosts, their hulls painted the funereal black of mourning and the stark white of purgation. The black ships of the Astra Telepathica, the silent, dreaded vessels of the League of Black Ships, began to change course. For millennia, these ships had plied the secret routes of the galaxy on their grim and holy duty, the collection of the psychic tithe. They were mobile prisons, their holds filled with captured psychers, their decks patrolled by null maidens of the Silent Sisterhood. They were objects of terror and superstition, their arrival on a world heralding the culling of the psychically gifted. Each vessel was a fortress of solitude, its very structure impregnated with psychic baffles and null fields to contain its volatile human cargo and its even more unnerving guardians. Now Corda was gathering them, not for their cargo, but for their inherent nature. He was forging a weapon not of matter, but of its absolute absence. The designated rendezvous point was the dead star system of Oculum, a place shunned by navigators and feared by astropaths. Here, under the dim, eerie light of a white dwarf, the fleet assembled. From every corner of the segmentum, the black ships came. They moved with an unnatural silence, their engines emitting no sound, their Geller fields projecting an aura of profound emptiness into the warp. Leading them was the Somnus Est, a vessel of ancient and terrible renown, the flagship of Knight Commander Asteria, a veteran of 100 purges, and the current mistress of the Silent Sisterhood's vigil in the sector. Knight Commander Asteria stood on the observation deck of her vessel, a place of stark, unadorned iron. She was a figure of unsettling stillness, her face hidden behind the burnished bronze of her war helm, her movements economical and precise. Her Vratine armor, the color of pale fire, made no sound as she walked. Around her stood her elite cadre of witch-seekers, their executioner greatswords held at rest, their very presence a suffocating blanket on the Imperium. They felt the approach of Sanctum Peregrinus, not as a sound or a vision, but as a pressure, a foul psychic sweetness that they yearned to scour from existence. Corda's plan was audacious in its simplicity and terrifying in its potential consequences. He had transmitted his orders to Asteria via a null-locked datacant, immune to psychic interception. She was to take her fleet of 130 black ships and create a moving wall of absolute psychic silence. By synchronizing and amplifying their individual null fields, they would project a zone of unreality, a bubble of nothingness, vast enough to envelop the entire pilgrim world. Inside this zone, the warp would cease to exist. Psychic powers would fail. The demonic would be banished. And, Corda gambled, the faith that powered Sanctum Peregrinus, a force intrinsically tied to the emotions and souls that roiled in the Imperium, would be severed from its source. He intended to starve the god machine of its divinity. It was a desperate gambit. The strain of projecting such a field would likely destroy the ships involved, their null generators overloading and consuming them from within. Furthermore, to sever such a potent psychic entity from the warp so violently could have unforeseen, catastrophic results. It was like trying to smother a star with a wet blanket. The outcome was far from certain. While the Fleet of Silence, as it was now called, prepared for its mission, the remnants of the Aegis Armada were being rebuilt and repurposed. Corda, his suspicions about Dristan now a cold certainty, had subtly stripped the Archmagos of all strategic command, citing the need for his unique analytical skills to be focused on a secondary role. Dristan was tasked with creating a device that could pinpoint the precise location of Cardinal Roth within the Sanctum Majoris, a task he accepted with his usual lack of emotion, though his inner cogitators whirred with calculations of this new, unexpected variable. He was now a prisoner of his own value, too useful to execute, too dangerous to trust. The true striking force was given to the only commanders Corda knew he could rely on to see the mission through, Marshal Armitage and the newly appointed Iron Father Ulkvar of the Iron Hands, a grim, taciturn warrior who had assumed command of the chapter's survivors after Captain Kvorin's ecstatic betrayal. The enmity between the two Astartes was a palpable thing. Armitage saw the Iron Hands' susceptibility to the chorus as a spiritual failure, a weakness of the fleshly soul they so despised. Ulkvar saw the Templars' blind faith as a dangerous, illogical variable, but Corda had bound them together with the chains of a common, desperate purpose. "The Fleet of Silence will create a window for you," Corda's voice echoed in the briefing chamber aboard Armitage's battle barge. Knight Commander Asteria estimates she can maintain the null field for no more than 15 minutes before containment failure becomes inevitable. In that time, the world ship will be blind and deaf, its power systems in chaos. That is when you will strike. The plan was a mirror of the first assault, but infinitely more daring. A combined force of 5,000 Black Templars and 3,000 Iron Hands would teleport directly into the Sanctum Majoris, the command center of the entire world ship. They would have one objective: to find and kill Cardinal Ignatus Roth. It was a decapitation strike on a planetary scale. "We will face the full host of his personal guard," Armitage growled, his hand clenching into a fist. "The fanatics from the chapel thruster will be as nothing compared to the abominations that guard the apostate himself. Your forces have been equipped with psycho-dampening helms and null-warding charms of our own design," Iron Father Ulkvar stated, his voice a metallic rasp. "They will offer limited protection, but they will burn out. Logic dictates a single direct thrust to the primary target. We will provide the surgical precision." "And we," Armitage countered, his eyes blazing, "will provide the killing blow." The alliance was as solid and as stable as two opposing tectonic plates, but it would have to hold. There were no other options. The final battle would not be fought for territory or resources. It would be a race against time in the heart of a mad god's fortress, a battle between zealous fury, cold logic, and a faith so powerful it could move a world. As Sanctum Peregrinus crossed the threshold of the Sol Proxima Gap, the last stretch of void before the outer markers of the Sol system itself, the fleet of Silence moved to intercept it. 130 black ships, engines cold, Geller fields inverted, prepared to unleash the terrible power of the void upon the heretic's prayer. The most desperate gambit in a war of desperation was about to begin. The clash, when it came, was defined by a profound and terrifying silence. The fleet of Silence did not announce its presence with a roar of engines or a blaze of gunfire. It simply moved into the path of Sanctum Peregrinus, a phalanx of black voids in the starfield, and activated the Cantic Null. A wave of absolute nothingness expanded outwards from the fleet, a synchronized projection from 130 amplified null field generators. It was not a sound or a light, but the utter cessation of both. It was the color of a blind man's sight and the sound of a dead man's prayer. As the null field washed over Sanctum Peregrinus, the effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The golden, shimmering void shields, powered by faith and psychic energy, did not shatter. They simply ceased to exist. The eternal, soul-stealing hymn was cut off mid-crescendo, plunging the surrounding void into a dead, shocking quiet. On the surface of the world ship, the continent-spanning stained-glass windows went dark. The plumes of soul fire venting from the chapel thrusters sputtered and died. The entire planet-sized vessel, starved of its Imperium fuel, went dark and inert, tumbling slowly in the void under its own immense momentum. It was a god, suddenly and brutally struck deaf, dumb, and blind. Inside the Sanctum Majoris, the effect was even more profound. Cardinal Ignatus Roth screamed, a thin, reedy sound of pure agony. His connection to his world, his choir, his billion-strong congregation was severed. The torrent of psychic energy that had flowed through him for decades was gone, leaving behind a barren, howling void in his mind. The floating servo-cherubs around his throne dropped from the air like stones, their beatific lights extinguished. The very air, once thick with the pressure of pure faith, became thin and sterile. His beatified honor guard, the Pontifex Guard, and the monstrously swollen procession warriors collapsed to their knees, clutching their heads and shrieking as the divine presence that animated them was ripped away. They were not dead, but they were lost, their minds trapped in a sudden, horrifying sanity. "Strike now!" Knight Commander Asteria's voice, cold and clear, broadcast on a secure, hardline channel. "The window is open. The pariah's peace is upon them." At that signal, the Astartes' assault began. On the battle barges of the Black Templars and the strike cruisers of the Iron Hands, teleportariums flared to life. 5,000 Sons of Dorn and 3,000 Sons of the Gorgon dissolved in flashes of lightning, their molecular structures hurled across the void. Their target was the data ghost of Cardinal Roth's throne room, a location pinpointed by Drustan's device just moments before the null field was activated. They rematerialized into a scene of muted chaos. The vast throne room was lit only by the faint, residual glow of arcane machinery, the grand windows now showing only the cold, distant stars, the Pontifex. Guard and other horrors were writhing on the floor, disoriented and screeching, their connection to their master severed. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer a unified, divinely inspired force. "For Dorn and the Emperor!" Marshal Armitage's war cry was the first sound to break the unnatural silence. He stood at the head of his sword brethren, a black-armored demigod of vengeance, his power sword blazing with lethal energy. Objective identified. Execute with maximum efficiency. Iron Father Ulkvar's metallic voice commanded his Iron Hands devastators and tactical squads, who were already forming perfect firing lines, their bolters methodically targeting the largest of the thrashing abominations. The battle at the heart of madness was a strange and terrible affair. It was not a glorious clash of faiths, but a brutal, one-sided slaughter. The Astartes were a force of disciplined fury, moving through the disoriented, screeching ranks of the heretics like reapers through a field of wheat. The Black Templars charged, their chainswords roaring to life, their righteous hatred undiminished by the psychic silence. They were not fighting a holy war now, they were simply exterminating vermin, and they did so with a grim, practiced efficiency. The Iron Hands were even more detached, their volleys of bolt shells tearing through the heretics with cold mathematical precision. They advanced in a solid block of iron and fire, their every action a logical step towards the completion of their objective. Cardinal Wrath, shriveled and powerless on his great throne, watched the massacre with wide, terrified eyes. The godhood had been stripped from him. He was just a man again, a frail ancient man watching his life's work being torn apart by vengeful angels of death. He tried to summon his power, to reignite the choir, but his mind found only emptiness, the cold, silent void that the Sisters of Silence had brought with them. Armitage and Ulkvar, an unlikely and unspoken alliance of fury and logic, pushed towards the throne. They moved at the head of their respective honor guards, a spearhead of black and iron. Armitage was a force of nature, his power sword a blur, cutting down any heretic that stumbled into his path. Ulkvar was a fortress of logic, his cog-toothed power axe rising and falling with the tireless rhythm of a piston, his integrated bolter spitting death at any target that presented itself. They did not speak to one another, but they moved in perfect lethal concert, their different philosophies of warfare complementing each other in a symphony of destruction. They reached the dais of the throne of beatific agony, the last of the Pontifex Guard, their minds beginning to clear, their fanatical devotion being replaced by the dawning horror of what they had become, formed a final, desperate ring around their master. They raised their corrupted weapons, no longer fighting for a god, but for the man who had led them to damnation. The Emperor's champion, Brother Valerius, strode forward to meet them. His black sword, untouched by the null field, seemed to drink the gloom of the throne room. He engaged the guard in a silent, deadly ballet, his every parry and riposte a testament to millennia of swordsmanship. Around him, the sword brethren and the Iron Hands Terminators smashed the last of the heretical line. Finally, the path was clear. Marshal Armitage, his black armor splattered with the foul ichor of the enemy, and Iron Father Ulkvar, his metallic form unscratched and implacable, ascended the final steps to the throne. They stood before the withered form of Cardinal Ignatus Roth, the architect of a billion deaths, the voice of the hymn that had shattered a fleet and devoured a dozen worlds. The old man looked up at them, his face a mask of pathetic human terror. There was no defiance left, no trace of the divine madness that had driven him. There was only the fear of a heretic facing his final righteous judgment. "Blasphemer," Armitage snarled, raising his glowing power sword. "You have mocked the Emperor's creed. You have twisted the faith of the masses into a weapon of annihilation. Your sentence is death." "Your existence is an illogical paradox," Ulkvar stated, his voice devoid of any emotion, his power axe humming. "It must be corrected." Cardinal Roth opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to curse, perhaps to make one last desperate appeal to the faith he had perverted. He never got the chance. With a final unified motion, the black sword of righteous hatred and the iron axe of cold logic descended as one. They struck the cardinal's frail body, and in the profound, unnatural silence of the null field, the master of Sanctum Peregrinus was annihilated, his reign of madness brought to a sudden, brutal, and utterly silent end. The death of Cardinal Roth was not the clean, precise end the Imperium had gambled on. He was the linchpin, the conscious mind that focused the raw, chaotic power of a billion captured souls. When Armitage's sword and Ulkvar's axe struck him down, that linchpin was shattered. The psychic energy, the accumulated faith fuel of a dozen consumed worlds, was not neutralized by the null field. It was simply contained, held back like a tsunami by a crumbling dam. The Cardinal's death broke that dam. A wave of pure, silent psychic force erupted from the throne of beatific agony. It was not the beautiful, seductive harmony of the choir, but a raw, discordant shriek of pure, undiluted emotion. The agony, the rapture, the terror, and the blind faith of every soul trapped within the world ship, all released in a single catastrophic instant. The Astartes standing at the epicenter were thrown back. The null-warding charms on their armor flared and burned out in an instant, their protection exhausted. The psycho-dampening helms of the iron hands cracked, their delicate circuitry overloaded. Even within the suffocating peace of the Cantic Null, this new power was so immense, so primal, that it registered as a physical blow. Marshal Armitage was hurled from the dais, his armor groaning under the impact. He felt a pressure on his soul, 1,000 alien emotions trying to tear their way into his mind. He fought it back with pure, focused hatred, the litanies of his order a shield of iron in his thoughts. Iron Father Ulkvar staggered, his augmetic senses screaming with static and impossible data readings. The sheer illogical chaos of the energy wave was anathema to his machine spirit. "The apostate's death has triggered a feedback loop," Ulkvar managed to broadcast, his voice distorted. "The vessel is unstable. All forces, immediate extraction." The teleport signal was sent, but it was already too late. On the bridge of the Somnus Est, Knight Commander Asteria watched her sensorium displays turn to a waterfall of crimson warnings. The psychic eruption from the core of Sanctum Peregrinus was pushing against her fleet's null field, not like a wave, but like a new universe trying to be born. The null generators of the black ships, already strained to their absolute limit, began to overload. Consoles exploded, power conduits ruptured, venting ethereal, anti-energy that dissolved whatever it touched. The Silent Sisters on the bridge stood their ground, their resolve absolute, but the ships themselves, the physical machines, were dying around them. "The field is collapsing," Asteria announced, her voice betraying no emotion, even as the deck beneath her feet began to phase in and out of reality. "May the Silent King watch over our souls." The Cantic Null did not simply fail. It imploded. The bubble of absolute psychic silence, which had held back the raging torrent of the warp, vanished. In its place, a vacuum was created, and the full, unrestrained power of the Imperium rushed in to fill it. The effect was akin to a breached dam on a cosmic scale. Two opposing, irresistible forces met in the space occupied by Sanctum Peregrinus, the raw, chaotic power of the warp, and the focused, weaponized faith energy of the psychic death scream. Reality broke. From the outside, the remaining Imperial ships saw the pilgrim world begin to convulse. Its surface writhed, the continent-sized cathedrals buckling and twisting into impossible shapes. Light of every insane, non-Euclidean color bled from the cracks in its crust. It was not exploding in a conventional sense. It was undergoing a catastrophic reality failure. It was being turned inside out, its physical form collapsing under the strain of the metaphysical cataclysm occurring within it. The Astartes strike force was trapped in the heart of the apocalypse. As their teleport signals finally locked on, they were pulled back through a warp that had become a storm of screaming faces and dying gods. Many did not survive the transit. Entire squads were lost, their atoms scattered across the hellish currents of the Imperium. Those who made it back rematerialized on their ships broken and bleeding, their armor scorched not by fire, but by raw uncreation. Marshal Armitage appeared on the bridge of the Sigismund's Legacy, kneeling, his power sword shattered, blood weeping from the seals of his helmet. Then came the final, silent scream. The imploding world ship, its physical form now completely gone, unleashed its stored energy, not as an explosion of fire and shrapnel, but as a psychic shockwave, a silent, expanding sphere of pure, metaphysical force. It was the concentrated death agony of 100 billion souls, stripped of its beautiful hymn, leaving only the raw, terrifying power of its belief. The shockwave hit the fleet of silence first. The black ships, already crippled by their generator overloads, were simply unmade. Their hulls did not buckle or explode. They dissolved into clouds of shimmering dust and frozen, screaming ghosts. The Silent Sisterhood, the Emperor's own weapon against the Witch, was all but annihilated in a single, silent instant. The Somnus Est held on for a fraction of a second longer, a testament to its ancient and powerful wards, before it too vanished, taking Knight Commander Asteria and her entire command with it. The wave expanded, washing over the remnants of the Aegis Armada. It was a wave of pure information, of pure emotion. Ships were not physically damaged, but their crews were devastated. Every soul in the fleet was forced to experience a fraction of the agony and ecstasy that had powered the Pilgrim world. Men went mad, their minds shattered by the sheer, overwhelming input. Astropaths and navigators burst into flames, their psychically sensitive minds incinerated. Servitors clawed at their own cranial implants, their biological components trying to flee the ghost in their machines. Only the Astartes, with their superhuman resilience and mental conditioning, were able to weather the storm, though even they were left shaken and stunned, the silent scream echoing in the depths of their souls. The victory was absolute. Sanctum Peregrinus, the greatest single threat to the Segmentum Solar in a millennium, was gone. Its master was dead, its unholy choir silenced forever. The objective had been achieved, but the cost was catastrophic, a price paid in blood and souls that staggered the imagination. An entire fleet of the Imperium's most specialized and irreplaceable vessels was gone. The Silent Sisterhood had suffered a loss from which it might never recover. The Aegis Armada, already crippled, was now a fleet of madmen and ghosts, its fighting capacity reduced to almost nothing. They had saved the Sol system, but they had done so by detonating a metaphysical bomb in their own midst. In the cold, silent void of the Sol Proxima Gap, where a world ship had once flown, there now hung only a shimmering, unnatural nebula of psychic dust and the wreckage of the very fleet that had won the day. It was a victory, but it felt like a damnation. The void's mourning was a long, silent scream of entropy. In the aftermath of the cataclysm, the Sol Proxima Gap had become a place of profound wrongness. There was no fire, no debris field in the conventional sense. Instead, the space where Sanctum Peregrinus had died was now occupied by the penumbra of ruin, a vast, shimmering nebula of psychic residue and temporal distortions. It swirled with colors that had no name and echoed with a silence that was heavier and more profound than the mere absence of sound. To look upon it was to invite madness, to scan it with augurs was to receive readings that were paradoxes and impossibilities. It was a wound in reality, a scar left by the violent death of a manufactured god. Drifting through this ghostly miasma were the shattered remnants of the Aegis Armada. The ships that had survived the psychic death scream were crippled in ways that no tech priest could easily repair. Their machine spirits were traumatized, flickering in and out of functionality, their cogitators plagued by data ghosts and phantom readings. Hulls that were physically intact would suddenly lose structural integrity, as if the memory of matter itself had been frayed. Geller fields, when activated, would project images of screaming faces onto the viewports. The fleet was not just damaged, it was haunted. The crews were in a far worse state. A full quarter of the surviving naval personnel were either catatonic or hopelessly insane, their minds shattered by the psychic backlash. Medical decks were overflowing with men and women suffering from maladies that had no physical cause, their bodies racked with phantom pains, or their eyes fixed on horrors only they could see. Commissars, what few remained, moved through the decks with a heavy tread, their bolt pistols dispensing grim mercy to those whose madness threatened to spread. The ships had become floating asylums, their corridors echoing with whispers, laughter, and the recitation of a hymn that no longer existed. Aboard the Star of Terra, Lord Admiral Vostok sat alone on his command throne, the bridge around him manned by a skeleton crew of silent, hollow-eyed officers. He had survived, his mind shielded by the sheer, barren landscape of his grief. But he was a broken man. He had presided over the destruction of 2 fleets, the loss of a sector, and now this Pyrrhic, soul-shattering victory. He stared into the swirling madness of the penumbra, his face a mask of utter desolation. He had won the war, but he had lost everything else. The weight of his command, the millions of lives expended under his orders, pressed down on him like a physical gravity, crushing the last of his spirit. The Astartes had weathered the storm better than the mortals, but they were not unscathed. The Iron Hands, under Iron Father Ulkvar's stoic command, had sealed off the decks containing their human auxiliaries, declaring them a compromised and illogical variable. They spent their time in silent, methodical ritual, cleansing their armor and war gear, attempting to purge the ghost of the psychic scream from their sacred machines through litany and sacred oil. Ulkvar himself was locked in his private forge, endlessly recalibrating his augmetics, as if trying to impose a cold, logical order on the memory of the absolute chaos he had witnessed. The Black Templars of Marshal Armitage were a study in contained fury. Their hatred, the bedrock of their existence, had carried them through the storm. But the psychic backlash had left a stain. They saw the faces of the damned in the swirling nebulae. They heard the whispers of the apostate cardinal in the hum of their ship's reactor. It was a new, intangible form of heresy, and it infuriated them. They could not fight it with a sword or purge it with a flamer. Armitage had ordered his entire crusade fleet to begin a regimen of constant prayer, fasting, and ritual combat, seeking to scour the taint from their souls through self-inflicted penance and unwavering devotion. The decks of the Sigismund's legacy rang with the clash of training blades and the roared catechisms of wrath, a constant, furious noise to drown out the lingering silence. The most immediate and horrifying discovery came from the astropaths. The few that had survived with their minds intact were brought before a grim-faced Lord Inquisitor Corda, who had arrived in system aboard his personal black-shrouded cruiser, the Divine Right. The astropaths, their sightless eyes weeping tears of blood, spoke of a new, terrible silence in the warp. The entire region surrounding the penumbra of ruin was now a dead zone, a psychic null space far larger and more permanent than the one the Silent Sisterhood had created. Astropathic messages could not cross it. Navigators who tried to glimpse a path through it were struck blind and mad. The Sol Proxima Gap, once the key strategic route to the Segmentum Solar, was now an impassable wall of nothingness. The victory had not only cost them their fleets, but it had severed a vital artery of the Imperium. Corda listened to these reports with his usual unnerving calm, but his augmetic eyes betrayed a flicker of something close to horror. He had sanctioned the use of the Fleet of Silence. He had approved the decapitation strike. The victory, and its catastrophic consequences, were his. He stood on the observation deck of the Divine Right, looking out at the penumbra. He had faced down demon princes, thwarted alien invasions, and purged entire bloodlines for the hint of heresy. But this was something new. This was a foe born of their own making, a corruption of the very faith that held the Imperium together, and its death had created a wound that might never heal. A slow, painful consolidation began. The least damaged ships began the grim task of towing the crippled. Rescue parties in sealed void suits moved through the silent, drifting hulks of Allied vessels, finding few survivors. The dead, when their bodies could be recovered, were committed to the void, their funeral rites a brief, mumbled affair. There was no sense of triumph, no celebration of the averted doom. There was only the quiet, grim work of survival and the heavy collective guilt of the victors. The shattered front was not a line on a map. It was a state of being, a brokenness that now defined every soul who had fought and survived the war against the pilgrim world. They had stared into the heart of a faith made absolute, and the reflection they saw there had broken them. In the sterile, cryo-cooled data sanctum of the Divine Right, Lord Inquisitor Corda assembled the final pieces of the horrifying puzzle. The chamber was a vault of adamantium and silence, its only occupant besides himself being the chained and psychically muffled form of Archmagos Veneratus Dristan Nanine. The tech priest floated in a stasis field, his many mechadendrites limp, his brass mask inert. He was a piece of evidence now, a living record of the heresy of logic. But Corda's attention was not on the prisoner. It was on the vast star chart hololith that dominated the room, and the web of sickly crimson light that was spreading across it. The reports had been trickling in for days, brought by haggard astropaths on desperate warp-ravaged vessels that had circumnavigated the new dead zone. They came from worlds far from the Pilgrim's Path, worlds that should have been safe, untouched by the war, and they all told the same impossible story. On the hive world of Cygnus Alpha, a spontaneous revival had seized the underhives. Billions of workers had laid down their tools, their faces turned towards the heavens, singing a wordless, achingly beautiful hymn. They spoke of a promise, a final journey, a deliverance from their toil. When the local enforcers had moved to suppress them, the crowds had not fought back. They had simply opened their arms, their faces beatific, and embraced the hail of suppression fire, dying with smiles on their lips. Their faith was a contagion, and it was spreading faster than any virus. From the Cardinal World of Ophelia VII, a report from a panicked canoness of the Adepta Sororitas spoke of schisms within the ecclesiarchy itself. Priests were beginning to preach a new radical doctrine, the doctrine of the active God. They claimed the psychic death scream was not an end, but a message, a divine annunciation scattered across the stars. They called it the Emperor's second voice, a promise that he was not interred on the golden throne, but was actively moving through the galaxy to gather his faithful. The heresy was subtle, couched in the language of piety, and it was taking root in the very heart of the Imperial creed. The most terrifying report came from the Iron Hand's own recruitment world of Mordian. Young aspirants, normally stoic and emotionally repressed, were found in the training cages, their bodies contorted in postures of ecstatic agony, their mouths whispering of a divine machine and a pilgrimage of the cog. The psychic echo, it seemed, had a particular resonance with those of a rigid logical mindset, twisting their quest for perfection into a zealous desire for mechanical apotheosis, a dark mirror of the very heresy Dristan had succumbed to. Corda traced the lines of the new outbreaks on the hololith. They formed a distinct pattern, a shotgun blast of infection radiating outwards from the Sol Proxima gap. The truth was undeniable, a conclusion so horrific it threatened to unmake the very concept of their victory. The silent scream of Sanctum Peregrinus had not been a final, dying curse. It had been a seed burst. The psychic death rattle, a wave of pure, concentrated faith energy, had not dissipated. It had traveled through the warp, a carrier wave of deified madness, and on every world where it touched a receptive soul, a spark of the Ignatian faith had taken root. "You were victorious, Lord Inquisitor," came the synthesized voice of Dristan IX, the sound thin and distorted through the psychic dampeners. "Your gambit succeeded. You destroyed the primary vector." Corda turned his ancient weary eyes towards the captive Archmagos. "And in doing so, I have turned a single monstrous fire into 1,000 smaller ones, scattered across a dry forest. I have transformed a heresy into a pandemic." "An unforeseen yet fascinating outcome," Dristan noted, a flicker of data lust still present in his tone. "The dispersal pattern suggests the psychic energy mutated as it traveled the Imperium, adapting to the local cultural and spiritual conditions of each world it touched. It is no longer a single coherent belief system, but a spectrum of related heresies, a truly magnificent engine of corruption." Corda's hand tightened on the hilt of his power sword. The urge to grant the Archmagos the Emperor's peace was a physical hunger, but he held back. Dristan, with his intimate heretical knowledge of the Faith Plague's mechanics, was now the most valuable asset in the coming war. "The war is not over, Archmagos," Corda said, his voice as cold as the void. "It has just begun. The enemy we fought was a single, corporeal entity. It could be targeted. It could be killed. The new enemy is an idea. It is a whisper in the dark, a hope in the heart of the desperate. It is everywhere." He looked back at the star chart, at the spreading crimson stains. They had cut the head off the serpent, only to find it was a hydra, and its blood had seeded 1,000 new heads across the galaxy. The victory in the Sol Proxima gap had not saved the sector. It had condemned it. The echoes of the beautiful damning hymn were taking root, not in the ears of men, but in their souls. A new, far more insidious war was coming, a war that would be fought not in the void between worlds, but in the hearts and minds of the Emperor's own subjects. The whispers of this new war were no longer whispers. They were a rising chorus, and their song was one of damnation cloaked in the robes of salvation. The Declaration, when it was issued, was a document of breathtaking audacity and chilling finality. It was known as the Cordon Interdictum. Transmitted from the Lord Inquisitor's flagship on a closed, multi-encrypted channel to the High Lords of Terra, it did not request permission. It informed them of a decision already made. The entire sector formerly known as Praxis, along with 3 adjacent subsectors now showing signs of the Ignatian infection, a region of space containing over 400 habitable worlds and trillions of souls, was to be placed under a total indefinite quarantine. All warp travel into or out of the zone was forbidden on pain of utter destruction. All astropathic communication was to be severed. The sector was to be excised from the Imperium, a limb amputated to save the body. The region was given a new, chilling designation, the Ignatian Veil. The High Lords, faced with a fait accompli and the terrifying evidence Corda had provided, had no choice but to assent. The decree was sealed. A cordon of Navy battle fleets, bolstered by entire chapters of the Adeptus Astartes recalled from distant war zones, was established along the Vale's borders. Their orders were simple and brutal. Nothing gets out. Refugee ships, merchant fleets, even military vessels that broke quarantine were to be destroyed without warning. The Ignatian Vale became a cage, a vast, star-spanning prison designed to contain a plague of the soul. And within this cage, a new, far grimmer war began. The Purgation. Lord Inquisitor Corda, now acting as the de facto supreme commander of the quarantined zone, became its warden, its judge, and its executioner. The heroes who had fought Sanctum Peregrinus were reforged into the instruments of this brutal new campaign. Their war was no longer against a single monstrous target, but against a diffuse, insidious enemy that wore the faces of their fellow men. Lord Admiral Vostok, a ghost of a man, was given command of the internal quarantine fleets. His task was to hunt down and destroy any vessel that tried to move between the Vale's systems, enforcing a brutal policy of planetary isolation. He performed his duties with a cold, dead efficiency, his once brilliant tactical mind now employed in the grim mathematics of blockade and orbital bombardment. He became known as the Silent Admiral, a jailer of worlds whose only orders were to ensure the prisoners never left their cells. The Black Templars, under a grimly revitalized Marshal Armitage, found a new and terrible purpose. The ambiguity of their previous fight was gone. Now the enemy was clear, the deluded, the heretical, the faithful who had turned to a false god. Armitage declared a new eternal crusade, the Crusade of Silence. His Black Templars became the mailed fist of the Purgation, moving from world to world, their drop pods and thunderhawks descending upon any planet that showed the slightest taint of the Ignatian faith. They offered no quarter, no chance. For redemption, their war was one of total extermination. They razed cities that had fallen to the new creed, their flamers purifying hab blocks where the forbidden hymn was sung, their chainswords reaping a bloody tithe in the name of the one true faith. They became angels of death, their black armor a symbol of final, unquestioning judgment. The Iron Hands, with the reluctant but logical cooperation of Archmagos Dristan, took on a different role. They became the analysts of the plague. Dristan, his life spared in exchange for his expertise, worked under armed guard to devise scanners and augur arrays that could detect the specific psychic frequencies of the Ignatian heresies. The Iron Hands, led by Ironfather Ulkvar, became the Witchfinders, their cold logic allowing them to identify the subtle signs of infection before it could bloom into a full-scale uprising. They moved with surgical precision, their strike forces eliminating cult leaders and destroying forbidden shrines with an emotionless efficiency that was, in its own way, as terrifying as the Templars' fury. The Purgation was not a war of glorious battles. It was a century-long nightmare of scouring, butchery, and suppression. It was a slow, grinding process of planetary lobotomies. Worlds that were deemed too far gone were subjected to exterminatus, their populations erased in a flash of cyclonic fire, their names struck from Imperial records. Worlds with only nascent infections saw purges that made the atrocities of ancient history pale in comparison. Inquisitorial stormtroopers and Sisters of Battle, brought into the Vale before the lockdown, became the masters of these worlds, their rule a reign of terror where a single whispered prayer could condemn a generation. The heroes of the war against Sanctum Peregrinus were transformed by this new, endless conflict. Armitage, once a beacon of righteous zeal, became a figure of pure, unadulterated dread, his name a curse whispered on 100 worlds. Ulkvar's logic became ever colder, his detachment from the flesh ever more absolute, as he ordered the cleansing of millions based on the cold calculus of infection probability. Vostok faded into legend, the weary admiral who commanded a ghost fleet in a sea of damnation. And Corda, the architect of it all, watched from his throne as the sector he had saved was bled white. He had stopped the pilgrimage to Terra, but in its place he had created a charnel house the size of a segmentum, a monument to a victory that required the death of hope itself. The war was no longer against an external threat. It was a war against the very nature of humanity, its capacity for belief, its yearning for a salvation that was not sanctioned by the cold, hard dictates of the Imperium. A century passed. The Ignatian Vale, once a thriving sector, was now a silent, scarred expanse of space, a testament to the brutal efficacy of the Cordon Interdictum. The great quarantine held. The faith plague, starved of new hosts and systematically cauterized wherever it appeared, began to wither. The purgation fleet still patrolled the lonely void between the isolated worlds, but their bloody work became less frequent. The fires of the Ignatian heresies, which had once threatened to consume a segmentum, were now reduced to dying embers, hidden in the deepest underhives and the most remote wildernesses. The war was, for all intents and purposes, won, but the silence that followed was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of a graveyard. The legacy of Sanctum Peregrinus was a canticle of absolute ruin, a legend whispered in hushed tones by naval cadets and novice priests across the Imperium. It became a cautionary tale, a dark fable used by the Ordo Hereticus to illustrate the terrifying dangers of faith untempered by rigid doctrine and absolute obedience. The world ship itself was a ghost, a symbol of a heresy so profound that its death had wounded the very fabric of reality. The penumbra of ruin, the psychic dead zone where it had met its end, remained an impassable scar, a permanent memorial to the conflict, forever rerouting the great warplanes and isolating the entire region from the galactic mainstream. Lord Inquisitor Valerius Corda lived to see the fruits of his terrible labor. He ruled over the Vale from his fortress on Cardoniash, an ancient solitary monarch of a kingdom of ashes. He had saved the Imperium from a catastrophic threat, a feat that would have earned any other man a place in the annals of glory. But his name was never spoken of with reverence outside the sealed vaults of the Inquisition. He was Corda the Butcher, the jailer of stars, the man who had amputated a limb of the Imperium and salted the wound with fire. He died alone, his millennium-old body finally giving out, his last moments spent staring at the star chart of his quarantined kingdom, his augmetic eyes seeing not victory, but a perfectly executed necessary damnation. His final testament was a single, sealed data slate containing all his knowledge of the faith plague, a poison pill for a future age should the pestilence ever return. Lord Admiral Vostok never left his flagship. He died on the bridge of the Star of Terra during a routine patrol of a dead system, his heart finally giving out under the strain of a century of grief and grim duty. His crew, what remained of the originals, interred his body in a stasis casket and placed it in the ship's foremost observation dome, so that even in death, the silent admiral could maintain his lonely vigil over the stars he had condemned to silence. The Iron Hands, their task of analysis and detection complete, withdrew from the Vale, their ships laden with the forbidden data compiled by Archmagos Dryston. They returned to Medusa colder and more detached than ever, their belief in the weakness of the flesh now reinforced by the memory of a madness that only their machine-like discipline had allowed them to endure. Archmagos Dryston himself was granted the Emperor's peace by Iron Father Ulkvar the moment his usefulness was at an end, his heretical consciousness purged, and his invaluable data absorbed into the noosphere of the Adeptus Mechanicus, a dangerous treasure to be studied by only the most logical and unshakable of minds. Only the Black Templars remained. For Marshal Armitage and his warriors, the war could never be over. The Crusade of Silence became their chapter's defining purpose. They were the eternal wardens of the Vale, forever hunting the last vestiges of the Ignatian heresy. Armitage, now ancient even for a space marine, his face a roadmap of righteous fury, knew that the faith plague was a weed that could never be truly uprooted. It was a potential that lived in the heart of every man. His Templars became a force of perpetual roaming terror within the quarantined sector, their arrival on a world a sign that the taint of faith had once again been allowed to grow in the dark. They were no longer just crusaders, they were an immune system, forever scouring a body that would never again be truly pure. The Ignatian Vale itself became a pariah sector, a vast, underpopulated region of quiet worlds and fearful people living under the constant shadow of the purgation fleets. Its culture was one of paranoia and rigid, joyless conformity. Any display of excessive religious fervor was met with swift and brutal punishment. Hope was a dangerous commodity. Faith was a controlled substance. They had been saved from the beautiful, rapturous lie of Sanctum Peregrinus, and their reward was to live in a cold, hard, and unforgiving truth. The balance of power in the galaxy had shifted, not by the conquest of territory, but by the creation of a vast internal wound, a quarantine zone that would forever serve as a reminder that the greatest threat to the Imperium of man often comes not from the alien or the demon, but from the terrifying, world-shattering power of its own belief.